Thank you very much for the invitation. Let me share my screen and say that I'm extremely honored to be of this panel. We have got 10 minutes, so I thought I will use this opportunity to share with you some of the concerns and issues which might have been useful for the different political practitioners to take into consideration when they were planning their move. So I would like to talk a little bit about the previous explanatory factors, which I think is basically insufficient to explain what has happened. Because and bringing into new concepts, looking at gender as symbolic glue and arguing that this is a new form of state, what we are actually looking at, and what are the consequences for the future. So what is new in this illiberal offer? Because we are still struggling with the different disciplines and the cross disciplines, how to explain what is happening and what is this thing what we are looking at. And there are several new elements which actually somehow slips through our fingers when we are trying to understand what is happening around us. This internationally coordinated program presented as unique and patriotic, and the political mass mobilization around the concept which is quote unquote gender, using fear and hate as mobilizational force, and using a new terminology, creating proxy meaning. So nothing is what you think should be. And lies presented very consciously and communicated to the voters, and voters are voting against their long-term financial interest. The previous explanatory frameworks, backlash, backsliding, authoritarianism, the failures of neoliberalism, fascism, neo-fascism, the anti-colonial frame, the opportunistic synergy, the illiberal pragmatism, or the deplorables, they are not necessarily explaining what actually has happened, and the election is only just the end point of this long-term development, what we are witnessing not only in Hungary, but globally. So these two new developments are connected to this formation of a new state and a form of state, and how the state operates, and also how gender became a symbolic glue, and how this new form of illiberal polypore state actually works in a gendered way. So with Weronika Grzebalska, we worked out this concept of the polypore state, and when you are frantically Googling what the heck this polypore is, this is this mushroom which lives on the trunk of the tree and uses nothing else than the resources of this particular tree to survive, and produces nothing else than this kind of mushroom. So it creates parallel organizations, it operates with security narratives, everything is a question of hate and fear and protection, and it's also privileging family over women's rights, and it is a kind of familialism when women are disappearing as subjects and agents of the change. We also wrote this up for all places in the Huffington Post, which also showed that our profession is also changing, that we are also publishing in outlets like this, not only in peer-reviewed articles. The gender as symbolic glue, with Esther Kovács and Weronika Grzebalska, we worked out this concept of how gender became a proxy for the rejection of the current societal order, the redefinition of citizenship, a key rhetorical tool for neoconservative actors aiming to build a new common sense about what is normal and legitimate. And this is also at the same time an attack on the language of politics, which became unsuitable to describe the feelings of more and more people, and in the more broader sense, the disenchantment of politics in the Weberian sense. So Here you can read this text, the gender as symbolic glue, and we were what are the consequences of this new form of state, which is operating very differently, and this is not creating a new form of state, which is not a backlash, not a backsliding, but it's a new form of existence, and it is actually operating in a gendered way. And everything what this state does in this new Cold War, which meanwhile became a hot war, is a gendered gendered activity. It is very much operating via gendered concept. That it successfully instrumentalized the weaknesses of the European infrastructure. It forced the different actors into a reactive reaction. And it actually revealed the lack of political imagination, which is one of the reasons why this was such a devastating loss for the opposition, which failed to track the transnational policy transfer from different countries, and it used the orientalization and the urbanization and as an explanatory factor to a global illiberal offer, which would require a much wider understanding. So that's, I was asked to give a kind of wider introduction, which I was really appreciating, because usually gender is just an appendix or a kind of a small workshop or a small panel. And this was really a great opportunity. Thank you, Myra, for the introduction, the possibility. Thank you.
Sure, of course. Thank you, Andrea. You're actually under time, so we'll have plenty of time to go back, because I think there's a lot there that we should unpack after everybody's given their initial thoughts on it. You know, particularly, I like this idea that, you know, we can't just see this election as a one-off, but we have to look at it as part of a broader process of the type of state that has been created, the type of institutions, not just an erosion of older, you know, the existing democratic institutions, but actually it's not like there's nothing that has been created in its place, right? There have been new institutions, new kinds of policies in its place. So hopefully we'll get to talk more about that as well. So now we turn to Dr. Zsolt Enyedi, who's a professor of political science at the Central European University in Vienna, as well as a senior researcher at the CEU's Democracy Institute, which is still located in Budapest. So I turn the floor over to you.
Thank you. And let me thank you also for inviting me. This is my first time at ASN and hopefully not the last one. As far as the victory of Fidesz is concerned, I think this was an over-determined event. There is a very long list of factors that can be held responsible for this outcome. The size of the victory was a surprise. And to some extent, we are still in the dark. And we are in dark partly about this outcome because we cannot trust the polls anymore. The polls were very wrong. And therefore, we don't know when this large majority of support behind Fidesz materialized, whether this was an outcome of the campaign itself, or it was there already well before that, and the campaign hasn't changed much. So some of what I say about the campaign itself will be based on speculation and intuition. But the most fundamental reason for the victory has something to do with the nature of the regime. There are many undemocratic features of the Orbán regime. The most important one, perhaps, is the incredible imbalance in information and resources between the political camps. The public TV is an instrument of the government. Just to illustrate that with a nice example, the leader of the opposition received altogether 5 minutes across basically 4 years in the public TV, while the 15th of March campaign speech of Viktor Orbán was broadcasted 9 times. within 24 hours on the public TV. So there is an incredible imbalance which is there for a very long time, and therefore, to some extent, public opinion is manufactured one. We don't know what would be the actual distribution of opinions if there was a level playing field. And that is that applies to money, it applies to airtime, it applies to access to various offices. In general, the state is identical with Fidesz, and both are identical with Viktor Orban. And if anybody votes against Fidesz, then one knows that he or she votes against the state. And this is quite a big hurdle for an ordinary citizen. Then the other factor has much less to do with the nature of the regime, and this is the very careful timing of spending, public spending. So what happened that about 3 or 4 months before the election, that the government started to spend to an incredible extent on increasing the standard of living in Hungary, something between 3 and 4 billion euros were spent on 13 months pensions, tax rebates, various extra benefits for those working in police and military and many other fields, big rise of salaries of certain professions, resulting in serious amount of debt and public deficit, but very much helping, obviously, the public mood. It's also important to mention that Hungarians experience economic growth already since about 2012, with the exception of the pandemic. Actually, a few weeks before the elections, the news came out that in terms of purchasing power parity, Hungary surpassed Portugal. And you know that is a big development, given that post-communist countries felt that they will maybe never catch up with Western, in this case, Southern European countries. This happened with other more Nordic states, but with Hungary, this happened the first time right before the election, and it kind of indicated to citizens that we are on the right track as far as economy is concerned. Then perhaps the third large factor was the war. Myra mentioned that it played quite an important role, and it played somewhat unexpected role in the sense that many thought that Viktor Orban's association with Putin will undermine his position. And the opposite happened. And of course, it happened so to a large extent because the entire Fidesz-controlled media, which is the entire public media and a big chunk of the private media, claimed that if Hungarians vote for the opposition, then Hungary will end up being part of the conflict. It will be drawn into the war because the opposition is reckless, will send soldiers, will send weapons to Ukraine. And even if this doesn't happen, they will certainly introduce and support embargo on gas against Russia, which will lead to rising utility prices in Hungary. And the general priority put in the public on safety, security, and low prices has definitely helped Fidesz to a large extent. Now, these developments were partly a function of the clumsiness of the opposition. But this clumsiness is not entirely down to the weakness of individual politicians on the opposition side. It has a structural reason. The Hungarian electoral system is very disproportional, and it was made more disproportional by Fidesz. Actually, the latest changes in the electoral rules sort of forced opposition parties together. And that meant that a cooperation had to be worked out between Greens, liberals, socialists, ex-communists, and ex-radical right-wing parties. This umbrella organization was established before the election, and while it was seen as supported as a great achievement, it came far too late, and it did not work in an efficient way. And it did not work in an efficient way, partly because the message was not put together properly. And here I'm sort of concluding the section on causes, and a little bit, I try to address the question, what specifically went wrong and how should we look at these issues from the point of view of democratization. Clearly, the opposition tried to access part of the Fidesz camp by nominating a candidate who is himself a conservative right-wing Catholic father of 7, and who thought that by emphasizing this biographic profile, he will be credible for the right in general. But it turned out that this is not something that Hungarians care about. What, how many times one goes to church, or how familiar one is with Catholic terminology. What they care about is a leader who shows competence and security and in general has a positive program. And there wasn't much of that. Most of the rhetoric was negative. And while this is understandable in a kind of semi-authoritarian context, that you criticize the rulers for destroying democracy, criticize them for corruption, the leader of the opposition went too far and constantly named the prime minister a thief, a murderer. He was constantly demanding that these people are put in prison. So he was seen as extremist after a while at the same time not really speaking to the core voters of the opposition. So there was something wrong about how the opposition sort of perceived the Hungarian society. Some of this can be changed and hopefully will be changed next time around. But there is also a fact that is difficult to face and difficult to find an answer to. And this is that since 2006, about 60% of Hungarians support right-wing authoritarian parties. And in the opinion polls and surveys, they exhibit right-wing authoritarian orientation. So anybody who tries to support a progressive view will have an uphill battle. And to the extent we have to think about the solution of this, probably it should be something that connects progressive values with ordinary concerns of Hungarians. Ability to show the link between the two will be the winning formula. Unfortunately, it hasn't been found this time. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Szabolcs. Yes, that was a very nice sort of understanding of sort of what happened during the election and where we are now. And again, there's a lot of questions to follow up on. But first, we will hear from Dr. Szabolcs Pogonyi, who is an associate professor in the nationalism studies at Central European University in Vienna. So I give the floor to you.
Thank you, Maya. Thank you for the invitation. Going last has advantages and disadvantages. I will use this opportunity. I'm sorry, I have to fix my windows. Oh, okay. So I will use the opportunity to speculate a little bit about some broader implications of the election in light of current developments, most importantly, the Ukraine war. What I will claim is that Hungary has arrived at a critical juncture, and the Ukraine war is a game changer for Fidesz and for the whole government. And it's a game changer in two senses. It's a game changer in terms of ideology and identity discourses, and it is also a game changer in terms of geopolitics. So first, I will very shortly, with some overlaps with what Andrea and Zsolt mentioned earlier, I will talk about the identity components of Fidesz's rhetoric and the implications of the Ukraine war on it. And then I will turn to the geopolitical implications of the election and also the Ukraine war. So first, just to recap, most of you, I'm sure, are aware of the most important dimensions and elements of Viktor Orban's illiberal democracy, or if you like, as he later called it, Christian democracy. So first, one of the probably the most important concept in his discourse is sovereignty. Viktor Orban and his government wants to maintain the sovereignty of the Hungarian nation, not necessarily the state, but the Hungarian nation. And he wants to defend the sovereignty of the nation from two different enemies. The first enemy, as he likes to call them, is the external enemy. Orban's government considers external enemies the European Union, Brussels, as they like to call it, and in general, multinational companies, the United States, all liberal governments in the Western Hemisphere. As for the internal enemies, it is basically the opposition and liberal intellectuals. In the governments and rhetoric, the internal enemies, like Soros-funded people, like all the three presenters today, are basically the puppets of some global power operating in the background, who wants to replace Europe's traditional patriotic Christian population with a foreign population in order to erase traditional values on the one hand, and through erasing traditional values, also to weaken solidarity and prepare grounds for a more exploitative multinational domination that is basically some sort of foreign exploitation. Now, I mean, I'm painting in very broad strokes, but as you probably noticed, this is a strongly anti-globalist, anti-imperialist rhetoric that is present not only among right-wing parties, but also on anti-globalist left-wing parties' agenda. So sovereignty is one of the key terms that Orban has been using for 12 years now. In relation to sovereignty, of course, demographic and population-related issues are also very high on the agenda. As you probably remember, the migration crisis in 2015 and its aftermath, Prime Minister Orban said that he wants to defend a homogeneous country. Hungary doesn't want to let in migrants, basically anyone, because it wants to maintain its Hungarian ethnic composition. Now, this is also a very important and interesting element, and I will just in a second explain how this is related to the Ukraine crisis and how the Ukraine crisis changes this whole ideological perspective. The last thing that I want to mention in relation to Orban's illiberal ideology is his cultural values. Very broadly, Orban pursued a traditional Christian conservative agenda, as I mentioned earlier. He wants to defend the traditional values defined as national, patriotic, and also religious Christian values. Orban and his intellectual hinterland, his media empire, his governmental NGOs that help him to send his message, often cite alt-right media outlets from the US, including Breitbart and other news outlets. I have a whole collection of issues, agendas, and actual articles that are borrowed from this alt-right media from these alt-right media organizations. So Orban is very consciously putting forward an anti-LGBT, anti-woke, this is what they like to call it, anti-woke ideology. He is often criticizing Western liberals, progressive liberals, not only for violating and jeopardizing traditional values, traditional family roles, gender roles, whatever, but also of violating their own basic principles, that is freedom of speech. Orban is claiming not only that he is defending traditional values, but also that he is defending traditional liberal values, including freedom of speech and toleration from woke progressive ideologies. Now, what about the Ukraine crisis? How does that confuse all this discursive strategy? Well, first, concerning sovereignty, it's pretty obvious that Russia has violated Ukraine's sovereignty. Now, Prime Minister Orban, as you probably know, has been good friends with President Putin. Not only because of the gas supply that Hungary gets from Russia, it would be very difficult for Hungary to replace it with anything else, at least in the short term. But also they have a close ideological connection too. If you listen carefully to what Putin and his intellectual hinterland says concerning basic values, well, that's very similar to what Prime Minister Orban and his government has been claiming. That is basically saying that, well, as I said, just like population exchange, the elimination of traditional values, forcing some progressive LGBT ideas, the toleration of homosexuality on populations that do not want it. Sometimes it's very difficult. It was very difficult to distinguish Prime Minister Orban's discourses from Alexander Dugin's or Patriarch Kirill's discourses preaching about the decline of the West. Now, despite all this, Prime Minister Orban could claim that, well, we are somewhat ideological allies, but we're good Democrats. Now, after the Ukraine crisis, it's very difficult to claim that his ideology is democratic, and also very difficult to claim that this sort of ideology considers national sovereignty as one of its most important assets. Well, Russia violated Ukraine's national sovereignty, which was very high on Prime Minister Orban's agenda. What else? Migration. Now, the Russian invasion of Ukraine also kicked off a huge wave of migration wave from Russia. That was also a very difficult ideological situation for Prime Minister Orban. Hungary has already received hundreds of thousands of refugees from Ukraine. As you probably remember, Prime Minister Orban and his government called migrants as migrants. This is a really weird sounding word in Hungarian. It doesn't really make sense. Who is a migrant? Anyone who is on the move. They were not using the term refugee because they wanted to make sure that these people coming mostly from the Middle East are not perceived as refugees who need help, but rather as alien migrants who want to do something rather than escape threats. Now, in the current crisis, the government calls refugees from Ukraine as refugees. I have a whole set of collection of articles from the government media, and probably the most striking one is that explains the difference between refugees, proper refugees from Ukraine, and migrants coming from wherever, from the Middle East. Now, that's from Magyar Nemzet, which is the most important mouthpiece of the government. In this opinion piece, a leading journalist, a pro-government pundit, says that Ukrainian refugees are proper refugees. They are white and Christian, as opposed to migrants who came to Hungary illegally in 2015 with all kinds of hidden agendas. Okay, so now what I wanted to show is that the Ukraine crisis created a very difficult ideological setup for the government, but so far they've been able to, at least until the election, they've been able to fit into their discourse these new developments. That was not a very simple task, as Zsolt also referred to it. According to some polls, the Fidesz electorate is extremely divided. 40% of them, according to the surveys that I saw, considers Ukraine and the West as the primary reasons and their actions as the primary reasons for the war in Ukraine. So they blame the war not on Russia, but on Ukraine and the West that wants to culturally infiltrate the whole East, including Hungary and Ukraine, and so forth. So ideologically, the Ukraine war created a very new situation for Orbán, but so far he has managed it. Let me now turn very briefly to the other issue that I want to talk about, geopolitics. As you probably know, Prime Minister Orbán has some geopolitical allies. So first and foremost, with what he called as the Eastern opening, he tightened Hungary's economic and diplomatic ties with China, Russia, as Zsolt also mentioned it, and other Eastern, even Central Asian states. Hungary has become an observing member, for example, of the Turkic Council. This may really sound weird. What does Hungary have to do with the Turkic people? Well, that's a symbolic asset. The Prime Minister and, more importantly, the Foreign Minister can visit Central Asia, and the national television can report on it that Hungary is welcome. It's considered as a very developed country, and so forth. Now, on top of the Eastern alliances that Orbán has some ideological and political allies within the European Union. Interestingly, well, not surprisingly, but interestingly, all of them were right-wing politicians. Like Le Pen visited Hungary and even got a huge, nearly 5 million euro loan from a Hungarian state bank to run her campaign in the current presidential election. Zemmour also visited Prime Minister Orbán. Salvini and Meloni from Italy are also strategic allies of Prime Minister Orbán. And of course, the V4 countries, first and foremost, Poland has had close ties to Prime Minister Orbán. And finally, in the Balkans, with Vučić in Serbia and Gruevski in Macedonia, and also with the current Slovenian government, Orbán has strong ties. Now, these geopolitical alliances were also very much stirred by the Ukraine crisis. As you probably know, most of Orbán's external supporters, including President Trump, including the Polish governing party, the Law and Justice, and even to some extent Le Pen became anti-Putin in this war. Orbán is trying to walk this tightrope by claiming that Hungary is in favor of peace, Hungary is in favor of strategic calmness, so we're doing whatever NATO and the EU wants to do, but there are certain things that we wouldn't do. We do not allow arms, weapons to be sent through Hungary, even if we pay for them. So what I wanted to say, I see Myra's appeared, so I guess I have only 1 minute now. So I want to wrap up, and I want to claim that after the Ukraine crisis, Orbán has become a persona non grata on the European level, even among his most important allies. So at this point, Orbán does not really have any allies. What will come next, we don't really know. We're at a critical juncture. So Orbán will have to find new allies on the European level to make sure that he can replace those whom he lost because of his Prime Minister Orbán's pro-Putin ideology. He also needs to find a new ideology to make sure that he can identify a new enemy other than the liberal anti-sovereigntists. And then third, it's a critical juncture because the opposition, I'm much more pessimistic than Zsolt. The opposition has been completely devastated. I don't see any chance that they can meaningfully challenge Orbán, either separately or together in the next election. So what will come next, we don't know. Orbán is a very charismatic person, so he has taken huge U-turns. He started out as a libertarian, liberal libertarian politician. He became a moderate conservative, and now he is a far-right populist, and voters seem to follow him. So we don't know what he wants to do, but something new, I guess, will happen. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Szabolcs. We do have some questions starting to come in, but I sort of want to prime a bit the discussion before we get into more specific questions. And I think this is related. I did want to give each of you a chance to just give the audience a little bit of a sense about what exactly is either unique or not about the regime that's been constructed since 2010, right? Because, you know, Andrea, you sort of mentioned this idea of a polypore state and the gendered nature. I wanted to give you a chance to maybe flesh that out a little bit, like give us some examples of what that means in terms of, you know, the possibilities for politics, and Zsolt, you know, you mentioned a couple of things like the media environment and some of the disproportionality of the electoral system, but just, you know, if you could talk a little bit about what you see as some of the, you know, again, either unique or uniquely strong parts of the regime that make it so difficult for the opposition to go forward, and perhaps Szabolcs to think about in turn, you know, you did mention Orbán as now a populist. How do we think of this, or to what extent should we think of this as a populist regime, and to what extent is sort of Orbán's populism either unique or not? So just to flesh a little bit more out, you know, what politics in this hybrid regime means, in this very specific hybrid regime, and then we can get into some of the more nuts and bolts about the election and what the opposition did or didn't do. So Andrea, I will let you go first.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for this opportunity to respond to the question. The uniqueness of the Orbán regime. I think this is on the one hand, a trap, because that would actually make the very general characteristics of the illiberal offer invisible. On the other hand, there are some uniqueness, and if I look at the question what Susan was asking in the chat box, that's also a kind of general question that you know, what can we learn from this illiberal offer? So what are the what is unique and what is not unique? I would say that what is unique in this particular state is that it doesn't have anything new. It doesn't have a single original idea. So that's why this metaphor of the polypore, I think, is really very useful, because as you know, Zsolt explained the different U-turns. I think this is a classical example of, you know, it really doesn't matter. So it's only a facade. It's only a polypore, right? Which needs the tree. Which needs the tree in order to exist, to steal ideas, to empty those ideas, and to use it for its own existence and its own enrichment, I have to say, because neither Zsolt or Szabolcs mentioned that this state is actually a state captured state, in a sense that it's a very specific state, in a sense that it's in the hands of certain oligarchs. It's very far away from the kind of market driven state, because this is only run by the dividends and European Union money. So if I would summarize, you know, the response to your question: first, there is not a single original idea here. Second, what is specific is that this state runs on the money of the others, taking money from the poor and the vulnerable, and from the uncontrolled European Union money which is running into the state. Third, that very often this urbanization and creating Orban and the Orban bashing basically makes it invisible that it's very much a global trend which is a result of the crisis of the neoliberal democracy, that no longer liberalism and market economy are considered to be the most successful combination. And there are some livable, viable offers now, which I called the liberal offer in my presentation. And this is getting more and more popular. Of course, the question is what can be done to stop this trend, and that's why we use this metaphor with Weronika Grzebielska, which, you know, it's very biological, I understand, but if you look at this state as a kind of mushroom which is living on the trunk of the tree, you know that you have to focus on the tree and the well-being of the tree and simply ignore what this mushroom is doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. Zsolt, did you want to chime in here?
Yes. Well, in the world of formally democratic countries, Hungary is very specific in the degree of centralization of power. In one hand, at the hand of Viktor Orban, who rules his party, rules the government, and has a very vast clientele, which is largely informal, but all formal institutions are also dominated by him. There is no single individual who would have significant decision-making power and would not have to thank him for having that particular position. This is something very spectacular in our world, in academia as well, in the sense that recently Orban decided to colonize higher education as well, and basically large majority of universities were privatized into various foundations that are governed by individuals chosen by Viktor Orban and who are there for life. Now, when, for example, this choice has been done, he was quite open, saying that, yes, not everybody has the same chance to be nominated into the board of these universities. Academic merit is not the primary guiding principle, but patriotism, devotion to the nation. And on the one hand, this shows how the state stopped being neutral, but there are political criteria for filling positions. But it also shows that Fidesz has an ideological discourse whose honesty can be questioned, but definitely is out there. And this lets me perhaps to go to a question that we received prior to the panel from Damon Lynch, who asked us about whether it's the case that Hungarians feel a kind of historical association between Orban and previous leaders of the country, going back 1,000 years to the time before the Hungarian state was established. Now, I don't know how many people feel so, but there is definitely a huge advantage that the right enjoys in terms of running a kind of historical narrative in which they are on the right side of history. And the left, after many attempts, still is outside of this circle. Its Hungarianness is questioned all the time. And of course, this is something that you can exacerbate very easily if you have the media power. The refugee crisis that Szabolcs mentioned was a very good example of that. There was a considerable degree of immigrant sentiment or anti-foreigner sentiment, xenophobic sentiment in Hungary. But once Fidesz started to focus on this issue, that sentiment was increased with, I think, 200% or so. So the degree to which he can change and kind of polarize and strengthen these potentially anti-liberal and anti-democratic sentiments is really impressive. Can be explained both by talent and by media power, but it is something that is there and clearly will be there in 4 years from now at the next election.
Great, thanks. Szabolcs, did you want to say anything here?
Yeah, I mean, let me second what Zsolt mentioned. I think, I mean, what you mean by uniqueness depends on your interpretative framework, right? I mean, just like from which perspective, but in general, just very broadly speaking, I very much agree with Zsolt that the most important peculiarity of Orbán's system is this kind of unprecedented centralization. So there is no question that any major issues are decided personally by Viktor Orbán. And let me also add that this is, so you have a whole institutional system that centers around him and around his will. He has the right people at the right places that he can completely trust. And it must also be admitted, like it's not, I mean, just like it's a descriptive term, that he is a very talented politician. So he has been in power for 12 years, absolutely unprecedented. Now in the European Union, he is one of the most senior politicians, or the most senior. I don't remember whether Ruti has been serving longer. And also, I mean, he is probably the third most referenced contemporary politician in US media after Macron and Merkel. Like that was just like his survey from last year. So he is used as an ideological trailblazer by the alt-right, and he also created something. I agree with Andrea that Orbán did not invent anything new, but the way he put together is really new. So I would not ignore it, because that sort of weird brew that he created out of elements that existed earlier, I think is special, and it's being emulated. Obviously, I mean, just all eyes on Hungary, even by the Trumpist CPAC. The CPAC will have a conference in Hungary soon, and they consider Orbán as an idol, and they have a good reason. They openly say it. Well, Orbán did it better than Trump. He's better than Trump. Trump should just learn from Orbán. So that's I think unique.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so I think those are all good lead-ins to some of the questions in the Q&A, and I'm going to sort of bring together Michael Toomey's question and John Torpy's question, because Michael Toomey is asking about, since this sort of capture of the media, the disproportionality of the electoral system, I mean, it's changed, but, one could argue that it started even in the early 2010s. Some of this centralization, this has been a factor of the last two elections as well. So he's sort of asking, I guess what has or hasn't the opposition won, and learned, and how come they couldn't change their strategy given that, or was there a possible way to do that? And then John Torpy was sort of asking about this issue of the beer and sausages, right? That you mentioned, Joel, to the sort of the payout, the strategic use of money. And this also reminded me of what Andrea, you were talking about at the beginning about this lack of imagination, right? That it seemed to sort of the discursive tools, the control of the media, the willingness to spend a lot of money and to go into debt sort of seemed to put the opposition in a difficult situation, in which even though they unified for this list, kind of led to a lack of imagination, right? So I guess the question would be, or two sides of the question, however you want to answer it. I mean, given this sort of the regime's willingness to mobilize, not to just sit back, but actually mobilize these different discursive strategies, kind of control the media space, to give out the beer and sausages. What, if anything, could the opposition have done better? What kind of strategies could they use going forward? So hopefully that sort of takes care of those two questions. Hopefully I did them justice. So anybody who wants to take that on.
I'm happy to start. I mean, this is, of course, the $1 billion question. So what the opposition could do. I mean, there is also another tectonic change which happened, namely that the original supporters of Fidesz had changed dramatically. So not everybody followed those U-turns. And by now, the Fidesz is a workers' party. And not really workers' party, but the underclass and the working class and the and those who are the lower middle class voters, and this kind of beer and sausage. I mean, this is this kind of real hardcore populism. What we see is actually operating with very simple messages and simple concepts, which is security, and kind of offers a certain security against this existential fear and moral panic, which was definitely there. So it hasn't been underlined enough, I think, that there is definitely a crisis in the Hungarian society, for which this kind of illiberal offer actually offered for lots of voters a livable, desirable solution and an alternative. And this that is the enigma, why the opposition was unable to say anything meaningful, or why it did not really offer, let's say, increase of pensions, why it actually remained only focusing on two important issues. One was the rule of law debate, which is really a very specific debate which requires serious expertise, and the other is corruption. And in a country where the state is non-existent and you can only go along if you are corrupting people with different ways, this kind of anti-corruption discussion is really doesn't fly, because that takes away the only secure pillar of these from the life of so many who actually think that they can buy certain things because rights do not work anymore. So if you want to ask the question why the opposition won, because they did not have any, they did not say anything meaningful about the important issues which are the issues of the majority of the voters, and they lost lots of opportunities to address really painful issues, including the environment, for example, and also the gender issues. Thank you.
Yes, and also I do want to get in, John Torpy's point, I think, that he's making is that there are also, there has been this corruption and patronage, and like Andrea, you said, the sort of voters for Fidesz have shifted, and I think there is definitely this rural-urban divide that we've seen, come out. But there's also, in many places, still high rates of poverty, right? So there were beer and sausages, but not, maybe not always that equally distributed. So I think that's an important question too, right? That in some ways things were promised, maybe there's a sense that everybody's getting something from the state, but I think it's a real question as to whether that was true until maybe relatively recently, right? So anyway, Joel, did you want to jump in? Yes,
thanks a lot. So I agree with Andrea that the emphasis of the campaign were misplaced by the opposition. They were, by the way, misplaced partly because of the leader of the opposition. Most of the opposition parties are leftist, left-center parties. And the prime minister candidate was someone who believes in markets, who is in favor of tax cuts, So there was a mismatch there, and I think that was a bit of a problem. And now, after the election, I hear some opposition leaders speaking that we need more left-wing populism on behalf of the opposition. There are many things, by the way, that can be done better. Clearly, the cooperation should be started earlier. The opposition should use its position in the local government to create an independent media environment. There should be a stronger alliance between municipalities controlled by the opposition. So there are many technical things that can be done. But whether they will solve the problem, I don't know. Even this issue of left-wing populism or speaking about the grievances of ordinary people or lower middle class is something that will be actually quite difficult to do, because now we have an extreme right party in the parliament, our homeland, and they are better designed to do this kind of rhetoric than the urban upper middle class opposition. So it will be really difficult. Of course, the very fact that Orban was lucky so far with almost constant economic growth, and most likely this will not continue, will create a new configuration. So in that sense, there is a bit more chance to come up with a kind of messaging that is able to weaken this lower class support of Fidesz. Having said that, by now there are strong local structures that support the Fidesz dominance in especially smaller settlements. And in this case, indeed, the vulnerability of the most poor in the society can be easily exploited by the government. So in a way, to come back to the question kind of assumed that you can overcome this dominance of Fidesz, that there is a weapon against it. And well, maybe there isn't. Maybe it's simply impossible.
Thank you. Szabolcs, did you have any thing to say here?
Yeah, I have a slight disagreement with Andrea and Peto. Maybe Andrea and Joe. Maybe I'm more pessimistic. Okay. I thought you lost me. So let me just go back to the surveys. The best estimate of the final election results was done by an economist who looked into real wages. And on the basis of real wage increases, he said that Fidesz should get more votes than in 2018. That was completely against what all the professional pollster companies said. So it's simply, I fully agree that Fidesz boosted its support and mobilized its base by handouts right before the election. True. But it must also be admitted that real wages has increased significantly in the past 10 years. As Zsolt mentioned, Hungary surpassed Portugal. The poverty rate has been on the decline. I mean, you can say that we don't trust statistics, okay? But still, the unemployment rate is extremely low in Hungary. So my perspective is, what I think is that, well, actually there are some, it's not only just buying votes. You have some real economic developments. This may well be due to the the post-2008 economic surge, may well be the result of the EU funding, but still it's inevitable, and people like to vote for incumbents if their economic situation has improved. As for the opposition, well, I think the opposition learned the lesson of the last 3 elections. That's why they created this coalition. And unfortunately, it didn't work. I mean, just, everyone was hopeful, even on election day, even in light of the last polls. Opposition politicians were still thinking that, well, we still have a slight chance. And basically everyone ruled out a 2/3 victory for Orban again. But let me also just as for the opposition, when we speak about the opposition is a category. It's not a thing in the world. The opposition consists of of Gyurcsány's party, a very unsuccessful and unpopular politician in Hungary, a former communist who became now a liberal and a Democrat. It is the second biggest party was in the opposition, the Jobbik party, which was a neo-Nazi party. Now it's a Democratic Party. And you could go on, you have smaller liberal green parties. So ideologically, in terms of the content, that's a complete mess. It's very difficult for such an opposition to make any sort of claims and real meaningful political program, because they are so different ideologically. Their only message could be that enough of Orban. We don't want Orban, but what do you want? And so I think that's why I'm more pessimistic. I'm not a campaign strategist, and I don't want to give advice on that. I don't know what they should do, but it's very difficult to imagine that they could do any better other than just trying to mobilize, which is basically doing exactly what Orban is doing, without even having any ideological coherence that Orban definitely has. One may like it, the content may or not, but he does have some ideas. The opposition at this point, I don't see they do.
Great, thank you. So I have a quick follow-up to that, and then I want to ask one question that's emerged about sort of what would remain in a post-Orban political world. To what extent? Someone is asking. Agnen Vangolov is asking, to what extent is this a personalized system? I think there's some ways in which there's some evidence that they tried to at least opposition-proof some of the things that were governed in the past few years. But I think that is an interesting question. Would this system fall apart without Orban? But also on you brought up the Jobbik question. I just wondered if any of our panelists had any sense of the role that Jobbik voters abandoning the United Opposition list might have played in the surprisingly imbalanced results of the election. So I invite you to answer either or both of those questions. Go ahead.
So as far as the latter question is concerned, definitely yes. There is clear evidence that in those regions of the country where Jobbik used to be strong, this is where most of the votes disappear behind the opposition. But in some sense, this is a very logical thing, and I'm quite surprised how many still followed the Jobbik's leader, because Jobbik used to be a proper radical right-wing party, and they moved to the center. So in a way, all of the Jobbik supporters should have abandoned the party, but apparently 1/3 of them did not. So in a way, I consider that a surprisingly good result. As far as what is left out of the Orban regime once Orban is gone, I think the regime itself will probably collapse in that form. But I think he did establish a tradition. It's a little bit like Peron. There will be Orbanism after Orban, I think. To some extent, of course, he built on Hungarian and other traditions, so he didn't invent too many things. But indeed, as Szabolcs said, the way he put them together is compatible with the era in which we lived. He managed to connect his rhetoric to world debates. He managed to say something relevant for people in Hungary, people outside of Hungary. He built a vast institutional structure, and he socializes new generations into a very explicitly right-wing authoritarian culture. And I think these new generations will well, follow him in his footsteps.
Any other takers? Andrea?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I would like to pick on this point of the how the surveys were wrong, but there is a surprisingly interesting element of this present election, that this is the first time when in every voting constituency there was an somebody from the opposition. So from each and every small constituency, there election circle, there was somebody from, very often from Budapest. And these people who were actually sitting in this more than 2,000 voting polls, they were sharing their experiences on Facebook. And this was a kind of mini survey, which is unique in the history of the Hungarian political system. And I would like to draw one element from this very interesting collection of testimonies, which is that all those who went into these very poor, very rural areas, which actually 98% voted for Fidesz, they were on the other hand unhappy with the Fidesz. So they were voting for the Fidesz, but even publicly expressed their unhappiness with this particular system. So I would say that it is really a historical mistake of the opposition that they did not say anything meaningful. I don't agree with Szabolcs's pessimism that they could not have done that because they are so different, because they might have started it earlier and they might have found the minimum program where they can actually agree on. But it did not happen. This did not happen, and that's why all this unsatisfied voters actually voted for Fidesz. And I just want to, this is there. They are unhappy and still voted for the Fidesz because of the security and because of the promise of a stability. And I would also like to, this is a positive element. And I'm sorry I play the glass half full in this triage. And the other is that Orbán very carefully and very wisely used the strategy of exit. Don't forget that the smart and the educated actually left Hungary. So in a sense, what Zsolt mentioned, that after the Gleichschaltung of the primary, secondary, and now the tertiary educational system, there is a very serious far-right populist tendency among the youngsters, but there is an exit strategy. And this exit strategy actually offered hundreds of thousands to leave from Hungary and do their education and build a life somewhere else. So this kind of diaspora, and CEU Vienna is one of those important institutions, can actually play an important role in creating think tanks and creating a cradle for thinking critically about different alternatives. So I would say that this system cannot be, cannot be compared to the Peronism because the diaspora and also the economic fragility of Hungary, which is so much dependent on the European Union funding, actually is different than the Peron and his system. But rather, I would say that the kind of very successful instrumentalization of the European Union funding and institutions to create this system, which is from inside, eats up the European Union and the different European values, that is specific, because nobody else had been so impertinent to do this. And this kind of slight banditry is something which is really unique. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Szabolcs, did you want to comment on this last round, this round of questions before I get into our sort of last set of questions about sort of the war in Europe and the refugee question?
Just 2 sentences. If you take a look at the polls, it's very interesting that that among young voters, Fidesz is not at all popular. At least not far. Its popularity is far beyond its popularity in general. So in that sense, one could be optimistic, but I'm not optimistic. So you have a whole institutional setup, all the institutions, just like down to for example, high school directors are basically party cadres. So even if Orban is out, the system, you have a working system, and this whole system was designed and is maintained by Orban. And if Orban is out, then the whole system will collapse, but it won't collapse fast. You have the inertia, you have a well-built up system that will survive long. And without Orban leaving, I don't think that this system can be changed unless there is an external shock. Like for some reason, Hungary gets involved in a war, or there is economic decline, severe economic decline. Then this would create a rupture that would probably give a chance to someone else than Orban. But other than that, I don't see how this could happen.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, so I think our final round of questions coming out of the Q&A needs to be about thoughts about sort of the broader relationship to Europe, also around the Ukraine issue. And I think the general, Zsuzsa asked a question in the chat, and there was another question in the Q&A about sort of looking forward, and if the war in the Russian attack in Ukraine continues, if we see more evidence of atrocities, if the refugee flow continues, or we have a kind of circular back and forth across the borders refugee flow, how does this play out long term, both in terms of Orban and Hungary's relationship to Europe, its allies, how long can they sort of, sit on the fence, sort of trying to play both sides a little bit, right? We saw some of this during the election, where you'd see sort of this publicly kind of neutral rhetoric, but then we saw a lot of the Fidesz supporters on Facebook and other places would be repeating almost the Putin line about many things. So, how long can that last? What might be the long-term damage? And I think Zsuzsa also raised the issue of, the Hungarian people, right? So sort of choosing to believe the security narrative, even with the experience of 56. So, maybe why that didn't play a larger role in creating sympathy for what the Ukrainians were going through. So if people want to jump in on that, I think that would be a reasonable and important place to end our discussion. So we have about 5 minutes. Yeah, Zsolt, go ahead.
Hungarian government politicians, Fidesz politicians, often tell to the camera that we are asked by the world whether we are on the side of Ukraine or Russia. And our answer is that we are on the side of Hungarians. And this answer will work whatever happens on the battleground. So it doesn't really depend on whether the Russians win or the Ukrainians, or what kind of settlement is finally produced. So it seems that there is a considerable degree of collective selfishness that is the norm today in the society. And this is something that is in contradiction with some of the historical traditions, but perhaps not with others. There is a struggle here partly about the role of morality in politics. And it seems that at the moment, it doesn't look like a winning strategy to moralize too much. People feel that East or West, dictatorship or democracy, these are not questions that really have to concern me. There are other issues. And in that sense, maybe the opposition either will have to have a less moral discourse or should be able to connect more moral positions with existential material conditions. And this is possible, by the way, because clearly you can make the point that being part of the West, being part of European Union is beneficial in long term materially as well. But this point hasn't been made well enough, at least at this time.
Thank you. Who's next? Szabolcs?
Maybe just like, yeah, some words. Well, actually, I think, yeah, I agree with Zsolt that that there is this sense in Hungary that, well, you know, it's not our business, right? And you had the Ukrainians who also did not treat Hungarians in Ukraine very well. So why should we consider them our allies in the first place? And also, let me also admit this: I'm like a very pro-Atlantic, old-fashioned liberal. So but still, it must also be admitted that they also have some moral claims. So it's not only that there's an absence of morality on the government side and among their voters, but they say, okay, right? So look at Afghanistan, look at Iraq. What happened there? So if Putin is a mass murderer, how about American presidents bombing Iraq or getting involved in Afghanistan? So you know, if Europe or if the US could intervene in Bosnia to defend Bosniaks, why couldn't Putin intervene in Donbass? So actually, they can create. I mean, I don't want to go into this how false this narrative is, but at least they have a moral narrative, and this moral narrative is to a large extent created and strengthened by Fidesz. That is, they claim that all the conflict is the result of Western imperialism and, well, basically what Patriarch Kirill says, literally the same agenda, just like slightly toned down. So, and I agree with George, Fidesz can play it forever, basically.
Andrea, last word to you.
Oh, that's a big responsibility. I mean, I would like to again play the glass half full. That what this war actually changed is that this whole anti-gender campaign, which was the center in the electoral campaign. And there was also a referendum at the same time when there was the election, which hasn't been mentioned, and some of the listeners might not be familiar with that, which was about totally false questions about the changing of the gender of nursery children, so which is a classical example of the anti-gender campaign globally. I mean, this is unsustainable anymore, because the World Congress of Families, which is behind this campaign and which supports the Citizen Go, which is a transnational organization, they are all connected with Putin and Dugin and the different money from the oligarchs, together with the US fundamentalist Christians, were supporting this particular gender as symbolic glue to create a space where this Cold War can be waged. And of course, the president of Hungary, Katalin Novák, she also had very close ties with the this pro-Putin oligarchs and different religious figures to promote this particular rhetoric. Now this is unsustainable, and this will be really interesting to see that what will be the new enemy. And since the war started by Putin with this rhetoric of denazification, I think that might be, that I would put my 2 cents on this concept of finding Nazis somewhere. So, I mean, but definitely gender is something which is hopefully and finally out, and gender as a symbolic glue cannot be used. But maybe I will be surprised, but this is my hopeful final word. Thank you.
I will take some hope. Thank you. And I'm also glad we got to mention the referendum, which was, I guess, the failure of that referendum was the only bright spots for those hoping for something more interesting in the election. There's something unexpected in the other direction. So thank you all very much. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to our audience for the very interesting questions. This is actually the last virtual ASN event for a little while because next month, the beginning of May, from May 4th to 7th, will be ASN's annual convention. It will still be online this year, but I encourage anybody who's not already planning to go or planning to be involved in some way in ASN, that there's, I'm sure, still time to do that. And then we will resume virtual ASN events later in the year. So please keep your eyes open for those. So again, thank you so much for a very interesting panel, and everyone enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.